The morning I realized someone was stealing my land, I wasn't standing in a courtroom. I wasn't holding a deed. I wasn't even angry yet. I was standing barefoot on my front porch holding a cup of coffee, watching 6 men with shovels carve a trench straight through my hay field. Now, if you've never lived in rural Montana in the 1890s, let me explain something. Back then, land wasn't just property. Land was survival. Every fence post, every creek crossing, every acre of pasture represented years of sweat, broken tools, frozen winters, droughts, and sacrifices nobody remembered except the people who made them. And that morning, somebody was tearing through mine like it belonged to them. My name is Abigail Turner. In the summer of 1893, I was 47 years old, widowed for nearly a decade and running a cattle ranch outside a little town called Red Hollow. Most folks in the valley knew me. Not because I was important, because I was stubborn. When my husband died from pneumonia during the brutal winter of 1884, everybody expected me to sell the ranch. A woman alone wasn't supposed to run 500 acres. At least that's what people said. I smiled politely and ignored every one of them. 10 years later, the ranch was larger than when my husband left it, which apparently irritated certain people, particularly Eleanor Whitmore. Now Eleanor wasn't technically a politician, but she may as well have been. She chaired the Red Hollow Community Association, an organization originally created to manage shared irrigation channels between local farms. Simple enough. At least it started that way. Over the years, Eleanor transformed it into something else entirely. She controlled meetings, controlled decisions, controlled who got access to water during drought years, controlled which families received support from the association. People didn't openly challenge Eleanor because challenging her usually came with consequences. Maybe your request mysteriously disappeared. Maybe your cattle lost access to a watering route. Maybe your neighbors suddenly stopped speaking to you. Funny how those things happened, at least around Eleanor. I hadn't attended one of her meetings in years. That alone seemed to offend her, which brings us back to that morning. I walked down toward the field. The workers noticed me first. Several immediately stopped digging. One older fellow removed his hat. "Morning, Miss Turner. Morning, Frank. What exactly are you boys doing?" Nobody answered. Instead, all 6 men looked toward a wagon parked near the fence, and out stepped Eleanor, long gray dress, leather gloves, silver brooch pinned high on her collar. The kind of woman who entered every conversation like she was already winning it. She smiled, not warmly, politely, dangerously. "Abigail, you're up early. You're digging through my field." "Yes." She said it as casually as someone commenting on the weather. I stared at her. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the obvious question. Why? She folded her hands. "The association approved a new irrigation channel. This route serves the entire valley." I looked around. The trench stretched hundreds of feet across my pasture toward the creek, toward land I owned outright. Nobody had requested permission. Nobody had spoken to me. Nobody had even knocked on my door. "You approved it. The board approved it." "Same thing." She smiled. That was the first moment I felt trouble settling into my stomach, because Eleanor wasn't confused, she wasn't mistaken. She genuinely believed she had authority over property she did not own. I pointed toward the trench. "That channel ends on my land." "Not anymore." "Excuse me." The association voted to establish access rights. Access rights. I almost laughed. You can't vote yourselves ownership of somebody else's ranch. Apparently we can. Behind her, one of the workers looked uncomfortable. Another suddenly became fascinated by his shovel. Nobody wanted to be standing there. Least of all the men doing the digging. I walked closer. The trench wasn't small. This wasn't some temporary water diversion. This was a major irrigation project. Weeks of labor, thousands of dollars, permanent infrastructure, and nobody had legal authority to build it. I turned back toward Eleanor. "Where are the county approvals?" "Already handled." "Show me." She didn't. "Where are the survey maps?" "Handled." "Where are the water rights documents?" "Handled." Everything was handled. Nothing was produced. Funny how that works. I could feel my late husband laughing somewhere beyond the clouds. He used to say that whenever somebody repeated the phrase, "Don't worry about it," that's exactly when you should start worrying. Eleanor stepped beside me. "The valley needs this channel. The drought is coming. People are struggling." I understood that more than she knew. Several neighboring families had endured rough seasons. Water mattered, but there was another route available. Everyone knew it. That route simply cost more money. This route crossed my ranch, which made it cheaper. And Alina had never liked spending money when she could spend somebody else's. I looked across the pasture, then back at her. You should stop digging. No, you should. No, the smile disappeared from her face. The mask slipped. For the first time that morning, I saw something deeper underneath. Resentment, years of it. You think you're better than the rest of us. There it was, the real reason, not water, not irrigation, not drought, pride, because I never joined her little empire, because I never needed her approval, because I survived without her. People like Alina can tolerate disagreement. What they cannot tolerate is independence. I took a long breath. Then I said something that would eventually change everything. You may want to reconsider this. Why? Because the county isn't going to like what you're doing, she laughed. The county won't know. And if they do, we'll tell them it's community land. The confidence in her voice was breathtaking, like watching somebody walk toward a cliff while insisting gravity was optional. The workers resumed digging. Shovels struck earth. Dirt piled higher. The trench grew longer. And Alina stood there watching with satisfaction. She thought she had won. Truthfully, I think that was the moment she lost. She just didn't know it yet. Because what Alina Whitmore couldn't possibly understand was that the little creek feeding my ranch wasn't just important to me. It was connected to one of the oldest water rights systems in the entire territory. And the men responsible for protecting those rights weren't local farmers. They were federal inspectors. The moment that trench reached the creek, Alina wouldn't be fighting a widow anymore. She'd be fighting the United States government. And that was a fight no amount of community meetings could save her from. But at that moment, standing beneath the Montana sun, watching the trench cut deeper into my field, I kept that information to myself. Sometimes the quickest way to reveal someone's true character is to simply let them keep talking. The next morning I woke before sunrise. Not because of the cattle, not because of the weather, and certainly not because I was eager to see Alina Whitmore again. I woke because somebody was hammering. The sound echoed across the valley long before daylight reached the mountains. Bang, bang, bang. Each strike carried through the cold morning air like a warning bell. I sat up in bed and immediately knew she hadn't listened. Some people hear a warning and become cautious. Others hear a warning and decide to double down. Alina belonged firmly in the second category. By the time I stepped outside, the eastern sky was only beginning to brighten. And there they were, more workers, more wagons, more horses, more tools. The trench that had crossed my pasture the day before now stretched nearly twice as far. They hadn't merely continued the project. They'd expanded it. Several sections already contained timber reinforcement. New piles of stone sat nearby waiting to be installed. Someone had invested serious money overnight. Which meant Alina wasn't just acting out of pride anymore. She was committed. And commitment has a way of making foolish people even more dangerous. I climbed onto my mare and rode toward the worksite. The workers noticed me immediately. Most looked uncomfortable. A few avoided eye contact altogether. The foreman was a stocky fellow named Harvey Boone. Decent man. Hard worker. Not the type who usually found himself standing in the middle of trouble. When he saw me approaching, he removed his hat. Miss Turner, morning, Harvey. You know this land belongs to me. His expression tightened. I know. Then why are you here? He glanced over his shoulder toward Alina. That answered the question. Alina was standing beside a wagon loaded with survey stakes. She looked pleased with herself. Actually pleased. As though the previous day had somehow validated her position. Abigail, good news. I wasn't aware we shared good news. The channel will be finished ahead of schedule. I stared at her. She smiled. I didn't. You ignored everything I said yesterday. No, I considered it carefully. And I decided you were bluffing. I laughed, not because it was funny, because sometimes disbelief is the only alternative to anger. Alina seemed encouraged by my reaction. You know what your problem is? She asked. No, you think ownership means control. Well, it usually does. She ignored that. This valley belongs to everyone. These resources belong to everyone. That sounds noble until somebody starts volunteering somebody else's property. That's when noble suddenly becomes theft. Several workers exchanged nervous looks. They knew it. Harvey knew it. I knew it. Deep down, Alina knew it too, but she traveled too far down the road to admit it, and pride rarely allows reverse. Around noon things became worse, much worse. One of the crews reached the creek. Now, if you've never spent time around Western water systems, you may not understand why that mattered. Back then, water rights were sacred. You could argue over cattle, you could argue over fences, you could argue over taxes, but water started wars. The creek feeding my ranch connected to a federally protected irrigation network established decades earlier. The moment their trench touched that system, local politics ended. Federal jurisdiction began. I watched the workers lower shovels into the creek bank. The first section collapsed. Mud slid downward. Water rushed into the excavation channel, and Alina clapped, actually clapped, like a woman celebrating a victory. I remember staring at her and thinking something remarkable. She genuinely had no idea what she'd done. That realization changed everything. Up until then, I believed Alina was malicious. Standing there, watching her celebrate, I realized something worse. She was ignorant. Malice can sometimes be reasoned with. Ignorance wrapped in confidence rarely can. The water began flowing through the trench exactly as intended. Workers cheered. Alina smiled proudly. A few nearby farmers arrived to watch. At first they seemed impressed. Then questions started. Who approved this? Did the county inspect it? What happens if the channel floods? Where are the permits? Questions have a funny effect on people hiding weak foundations. They make them angry. Alina immediately became angry. Very angry. She dismissed concerns, dismissed risks, dismissed legal requirements, dismissed common sense, and every answer sounded worse than the last. Finally, old Samuel Griggs spoke up. Now Samuel was nearly 70, one of the oldest ranchers in the valley, a man respected by everyone, including people who didn't particularly like him. Samuel pointed his cane toward the creek. Alina, did Washington approve this diversion? She crossed her arms. We don't need Washington's permission. A silence settled across the crowd, not because people agreed, because they couldn't believe what they'd just heard. Samuel looked at me, then at the channel, then back at Alina. Lord help us, that was all he said. Lord help us, and then he rode away. About an hour later help arrived, not from heaven, from Helena. 3 riders appeared on the northern road shortly after lunch. At first nobody paid attention. Travelers were common. Then I noticed the badges, then the satchels, then the government seals, Federal Water Commission. The workers saw them too. The shoveling slowed, then stopped. By the time the inspectors reached the worksite, complete silence had settled over the field. The lead inspector introduced himself as Thomas Reed, tall man, gray mustache, the sort of person who didn't waste words. Afternoon. Who's responsible for this construction? Alina stepped forward immediately. I am, without hesitation. Without caution, without a lawyer. I almost admired the confidence. Almost. Inspector Reed surveyed the trench, the diverted creek, the damaged bank, the unfinished supports. Then he looked directly at Alina. May I see the authorization documents? Her smile flickered. The what? Authorization documents, permits, approvals, survey certifications, water diversion rights, any of them. The smile disappeared entirely. We have community approval. The inspector blinked. Community approval. Yes. The association voted unanimously. Several workers quietly stepped backward. Even they knew where this was heading. Inspector Reed removed a small notebook. Ma'am, federal law does not recognize community approval as authorization to alter protected waterways. Alina folded her arms. I disagree. The inspector stared at her, then slowly wrote something down. To this day, I still wonder what he wrote. Whatever it was couldn't have been complimentary. The inspection lasted 3 hours. Measurements, photographs, witness statements, site evaluations. The deeper they looked, the worse things became. Structural problems, safety violations, unauthorized diversions, potential downstream flooding. Everything Alina dismissed the day before suddenly appeared in official reports. Reality has a habit of doing that. By sunset, the conclusion was unavoidable. The project was illegal, completely illegal. Inspector Reed gathered everyone near the worksite. Workers, farmers, association members, curious neighbors. Then he read the official order. Effective immediately, all construction activities are suspended pending federal review. No additional work may continue. No modifications may be made. No materials may be removed. Violation of this order may result in prosecution. The crowd fell silent, some relieved, some nervous, all watching Alina, waiting, wondering. For a moment she simply stood there, still, motionless, like a gambler staring at a losing hand. And then she did something nobody expected. She laughed, not a nervous laugh, not an embarrassed laugh, a furious laugh. "You people are ridiculous." Inspector Reed didn't react. "This project benefits the valley, perhaps. Then why stop it? Because laws exist." The smile vanished. For the first time since I'd known her, Alina looked uncertain. Only for a second, then pride returned. "Fine," she snapped. "I'll appeal, you may. I'll challenge this, you may. I'll take it to Washington, you may." Every answer was calm, professional, final, and somehow that infuriated her even more. The workers began packing tools, the crowd slowly dispersed. The sun dipped behind the mountains, and Alina remained standing beside the unfinished channel, watching everything she built grind to a halt. I started toward my horse when I heard her voice. "Abigail," I turned. "This isn't over." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." Her eyes narrowed. "You think you've won." I looked around the valley, at the silent trench, at the departing inspectors, at the workers heading home, at the creek flowing exactly where nature intended. Then I looked back at Alina. "No," I said quietly, "I think you've only just begun to lose." She hated that answer. I could see it. Because deep down she was starting to realize something. This wasn't a disagreement anymore. This wasn't a neighborhood argument. This wasn't two stubborn women competing for influence. The moment those federal inspectors arrived, the entire game changed. And somewhere beyond the mountains, reports were already moving across desks. Signatures were being requested. Questions were being asked. Names were being written down, including hers. But neither of us knew then how far those questions would go, or what investigators would eventually discover buried beneath Alina's irrigation project. Because the illegal channel wasn't the real story. It was only the first thread. And once somebody started pulling, the entire thing would begin to unravel. For about a week after the federal shutdown order, the valley became unusually quiet. Too quiet. The workers disappeared. The horses were gone. The tools vanished. The half-finished irrigation channel sat abandoned in the middle of my pasture like a scar nobody knew how to explain. And Alina Whitmore, for the first time in over a decade, she stopped attending community gatherings. People noticed. In a town like Red Hollow, people always noticed. At the general store, conversations lowered when someone mentioned her name. At church, folks whispered before Sunday service. Even the blacksmith, who normally stayed out of everyone's business, seemed unusually interested in developments. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, but everyone could feel something moving beneath the surface. And then the letters arrived. Official letters, federal letters, county letters, legal notices, requests for records, requests for financial documents, requests for meeting minutes, requests for land surveys, requests for water agreements dating back years. At first, most people assumed the investigation was only about the irrigation channel. I thought so too. I was wrong, very wrong. The first clue appeared when Samuel Griggs knocked on my door one evening. He looked troubled, more troubled than I'd ever seen him. We sat on the porch while the sun disappeared behind the hills. After a few minutes, he finally spoke. "Abigail, you ever wonder where all that association money went?" I frowned. "What money?" Samuel laughed softly. "Exactly." Over the next hour, he told me things I had never heard before. Small things, strange things, association projects approved but never completed, funds allocated but never accounted for, maintenance budgets that seemed unusually large, repairs that somehow always required additional collections from members. Nothing dramatic by itself, but together. Together they painted a troubling picture. The next morning I rode into town. By noon I had spoken with 6 different families. By sunset I'd spoken with 11, and every conversation sounded remarkably similar: missing records, confusing expenses, unanswered questions. For years people simply trusted Alina. Nobody checked, nobody challenged, nobody demanded explanations, until now. And once people started asking questions, they couldn't stop. 3 weeks later, federal investigators returned. This time they weren't examining dirt. They weren't measuring water flow. They weren't inspecting construction. They were auditing records, boxes and boxes of records. I watched wagon loads of documents being carried from the association office. Ledgers, contracts, receipts, correspondence, years' worth of paperwork. The deeper investigators dug, the uglier things became. One afternoon, Inspector Reed visited my ranch. He looked exhausted. The way a man looks when reality turns out worse than expected. We sat beneath the cottonwood tree near the creek. Finally, I asked, "How bad is it?" He stared toward the valley. "Have you ever pulled up a rotten fence post?" "Sure, looks solid from a distance." "Exactly. Then one day you touch it and the entire thing collapses." That was the first moment I realized the channel itself had become almost irrelevant. The irrigation project wasn't the disease, it was the symptom. A symptom of years of unchecked power. Months passed, summer turned into autumn, leaves changed color, the air grew colder. Then one morning every resident in Red Hollow received the same notice. A public hearing, county courthouse. Mandatory attendance for association officers, recommended attendance for community members. People talked about little else for days. By the morning of the hearing, the courthouse looked more crowded than I'd ever seen it. Farmers, merchants, ranchers, widows, veterans, families. Practically the entire valley showed up. Some were curious, others were angry, most simply wanted answers. I arrived early. The courtroom already buzzed with conversation. Then the doors opened, and a leaner walked in. For a moment I almost didn't recognize her. The woman who entered that room wasn't the same person who stood proudly beside that illegal trench months earlier. She looked older, smaller, tired, not physically, spiritually. The confidence was still there. But it felt forced now, like a candle struggling against the wind. She took her seat without speaking. Nobody greeted her. Nobody smiled. Nobody waved. That may have hurt more than anything else. The hearing began promptly. For hours, investigators presented evidence. Financial records, witness statements, bank transactions, meeting documents, missing funds, unauthorized spending, fabricated approvals, manipulated votes. The room grew quieter with every new revelation. People weren't simply learning that a leaner made mistakes. They were discovering she'd been misleading them for years, not because she needed money, not because she was desperate, because she enjoyed control. That was the hardest part for many people to accept. There wasn't some grand emergency, no tragic explanation, no hidden sacrifice, just a woman who became addicted to authority. Eventually, the county commissioner called a leaner forward. The room fell silent. She stood slowly, walked to the front, faced the crowd. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the commissioner asked a simple question. "Did you authorize the irrigation project knowing you lacked legal authority?" Everyone waited. A leaner looked around the room, at neighbors, friends, people who had trusted her, people who no longer did. Finally, she answered, "Yes." The words seemed to suck all the air from the room. The commissioner continued, "Did you knowingly bypass federal water regulations?" A long pause. Then another answer, "Yes." A woman near the back began crying, not loudly, quietly. The kind of crying that comes from disappointment rather than grief, and somehow that felt worse. Question after question followed, and with each answer another piece of a leaner's reputation disappeared. By late afternoon, the conclusions were unavoidable. The association would be reorganized, new leadership installed, financial oversight established, restitution ordered, the illegal channel permanently removed, environmental restoration funded. As for a leaner, she would never hold authority within the association again. When the ruling ended, nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. This wasn't that kind of victory. There are moments in life when justice feels triumphant, and there are moments when it simply feels sad. This was the second kind. People slowly filed from the courtroom, some relieved, some angry, some strangely heartbroken. I remained seated, watching, thinking. Eventually, I noticed a leaner still standing alone near the front. Everyone else had left. For several minutes, she simply stared at the empty benches. Then she turned and noticed me. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, she walked over, slowly, like someone carrying an invisible weight. "You knew this would happen." "Maybe," she nodded. "I thought I was helping." The honesty surprised me. Perhaps because it arrived too late. Perhaps because it sounded genuine. "Maybe you were at first." She looked away. When did it change? That question lingered between us. Longer than either of us expected. Finally, I answered, probably around the time you stopped asking people what they needed and started telling them. For the first time in years, Alina didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't lecture, didn't accuse. She simply stood there, quiet. The way ordinary people do when they're finally forced to meet themselves honestly. After a while, she nodded. Maybe you're right, maybe. We stood together near the courthouse steps as evening settled over Red Hollow. The sky burned orange across the horizon, a beautiful ending to an ugly chapter. A few minutes later, she walked away. No dramatic speech, no final argument, no threats, just a tired woman disappearing down a dusty street. And that was the last time I ever saw Alina Whitmore. By winter, she had sold her house. By spring, she was gone. Nobody seemed to know where, or perhaps nobody cared enough to ask. The channel was eventually removed, the creek restored, my pasture recovered. Life moved forward the way it always does, slowly, quietly, one season at a time. But every now and then, usually when I'm sitting on the porch watching the sun settle behind the hills, I find myself thinking about Alina, not because I miss her, and certainly not because I excuse what she did. I think about her because her story reminds me of something important. Most people don't wake up one morning planning to become villains. Usually it happens a little at a time. One compromise, one shortcut, one justification, one unchecked decision after another, until eventually they stop seeing the line they crossed years ago. Maybe that's why this story still stays with me, because the real danger wasn't Alina's ambition. It wasn't her arrogance. It wasn't even the illegal channel. The real danger was how many good people stayed silent while it happened. And that brings me to you. If you had lived in Red Hollow back then, what would you have done? Would you have challenged Alina sooner? Would you have spoken up when things started feeling wrong? Or would you have stayed quiet like so many others? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave a comment below and tell me where you stand. And if you've ever dealt with someone who let power go to their head, share your story too. Sometimes the most important conversations start with ordinary people refusing to stay silent. And sometimes that's exactly how communities save themselves.